Welcome all. I'm sure you all have gained a lot of insights from our keynote session. Now, moving to another interesting session, leading in economic turmoil. We have global leaders on our panel today. And to welcome our esteemed panelists and to moderate the session, let me invite Dr. Anurag Batra. Dr. Batra is one of the youngest media mogul from India. He's a serial entrepreneur and a mentor to many successful entrepreneurs. Besides being an entrepreneur, Dr. Batra is an author, an angel investor, a TV show host, and the founder of iconic Exchange for Media Group and the chairman and editor-in-chief of Businessworld Group. I was fascinated by his belief that if you make your profession your hobby, you don't have to work and life becomes a blessing. What a marvelous thought. Over to you, Dr. Batra, to introduce the speakers and continue with the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Aparna, for the kind introductions. Introductions are always flattering. I hope I can do justice to it. But what makes this conference and this panel special is the three special guests that we have. They come from diverse backgrounds and have deep knowledge of what is being discussed, leadership, and especially in terms of gender diversity and inclusion. Let me introduce the three panelists and then bring them one by one for their opening comment. Let me first introduce Ms. Anu Madgavkar. She is a partner at the McKinsey Global Institute, which is a global business and economic research arm of McKinsey and Company. Her research focuses on labor markets, inclusive growth, inequality, and the impact of technology. She's based in Mumbai. She has a global perspective. Welcome, Anu, to this conversation. Let me also bring in Henriette. She leads the Gender and Economy Inclusion Group at the IFC, and she's a member of the committee that leads it. IFC is a member of the World Bank. She also serves as an advocate for gender equality issues in the private sector and work with IFC's clients to include both men and women as entrepreneurs, employees, consumer, community leaders, community stakeholders. She leads a team that is encouraged in co-creating gender-smart private sector solutions through research, investments, advocacy, advice, and peer learning platforms. Welcome, Henriette. Last but not the least, we have Dr. Sanjay Katuriya. He's a senior visiting fellow at the Center for Policy Research, India. He's a former lead economist at the World Bank in Washington. He holds a PhD in economics from Oxford University. In his 27 years at the World Bank, he worked in South Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, Eastern Europe, and he also had field assignments in New Delhi and Dhaka. He's going to teach a course at a prestigious university from January 2021, and I'm sure he's looking forward to that. With this, let me set the rules of the discussion. I'll invite all the panelists for their opening remarks for about 5 minutes. Then we'll do a short discussion, and at the end, we'll take the audience questions. In the last 8 months, the world possibly needs gender diversity and inclusion more than ever. Women in their homes are having to do much more. Working women who are also leaders in their field and also home nurturers are having to balance their responsibilities even much more. And when we talk of diversity, today when we talk of LGBT, we talk of people from various nationalities, and especially India is now seeing a multicultural workforce. And overall, the world needs to be a better place. We need leadership that creates gender diversity and inclusion in a deep way. Anu, let me first bring you in for your opening comments on where the world is and what are the trends that you see across the globe.
Thank you very much, Anurag, for that, for setting it up, I think, and teeing up what an important topic this is. Also, just wanted to say that it's a huge privilege to be invited by Talentnomics for this, along with this distinguished panel, and it's a very important topic. Now, as you rightly said, I think as you think about the impact of this pandemic on women, there are many dimensions. But one of the most grave and significant dimensions is, I think, the way it has hit women harder and disproportionately in the realm of the economy. So women have been hit harder. We at McKinsey Global Institute had looked at the data back in July, and what we saw at that point was that women were almost 2 times as likely, 1.8 times as likely to be unemployed as men were due to the consequences of COVID-19. So globally, while women made up about 39% of the workforce, they made up about 54% of all unemployment. And if you look at India, where I'm sitting, the unemployment numbers today, they've improved since July, but even today, I think women's unemployment is about 11% relative to about 7% for men, right? And it's not just the unemployment. What is even more significant and has longer term consequences is that women are dropping out or leaving the workforce in greater numbers than men are. And again, we are seeing this in many different countries. So, for example, in the US, if you look at the latest job dropouts from the workforce in September, there were a little over 1 million people who left the workforce. 80% of those were women. Or back in India, if you look at the numbers between January and September, so roughly over the pandemic period, 13% of women who were in the workforce at the beginning of the year have dropped out now, but only 5% of men have. So why this disproportionate burden or effect on women? Part of it is because women are concentrated in sectors and occupations which are particularly hit by the unique nature of this pandemic. This is a services-led crisis in the economy, and women are disproportionately concentrated in retail, sales and service, accommodation and food, hospitality types of sectors. That's one reason. But the second reason, as you pointed out, is that the load of all the care work, the care, the unpaid work that we do, which keeps our families and us sort of going, that is disproportionately on women. And the burden of that has actually risen a lot. The statistics are actually very striking. In India, the numbers have gone up 30% on an already very skewed time allocation between men and women in terms of the care work. Now, this has actually huge economic consequences. This is the last point I'll make. But if you look at what this means for global GDP, based on our estimates, you look out to say 2030. And if you assume that these negative consequences are not reversed, what it means is that the world would have $1 trillion lower GDP by 2030 than what it would otherwise, simply because of this effect of more women actually not being able to participate in the economy. $1 trillion hit relative to the opportunity, which we should also talk about, which is to say that if the world takes the right steps now to correct these imbalances, and these are long-standing imbalances, just exacerbated by COVID, but if we take the right steps to correct them, we could actually have a $12 trillion higher GDP in 2030. Relative to a negative 1 trillion. So that's a vast sort of upside or downside, depending on the way you think about it. And GDP is just one crude estimate, I would say, of the big economic and social advantages to the world, to families, to individuals, to societies, if we actually correct many of these gender imbalances. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to exploring many of these as we hear from the others.
Thank you, Anu, for being so specific and short. What would be interesting to know is what are the solutions, especially, what can we in India learn from other countries? I think on these two specific issues, I'll come back to you. Let me bring in Dr. Sanjay Katuriya. Dr. Sanjay Katuriya, with the kind of experience you had at World Bank in various geographies, various countries, and dealing with countries in kind of different stages of evolution with respect to gender diversity and inclusion, your perspective would be very valuable. Please share your opening comments.
Thank you very much, Anurag, and I'm indeed privileged to be in this company. I will be brief, and Anu has already laid out the ground, the context. So given time constraints, I will highlight a few key issues only. So let me start with, and I'll focus on what the public sector or the government can do. Let me start with 3 goals that governments should address, right? So that one is that women survive and stay healthy. Second is a kind of holding operation, that is to minimize losses to women's jobs and women-owned firms and to girls' education. And the third one is how to use the crisis to ensure that women come back stronger. So I'll make a few points in each of these areas. First, ensuring that women stay healthy and survive. Now, women have been disproportionately affected, as Anu said. One way to address this, immediate way, is to get cash out to them. And indeed, since March 2020, more than 200 countries and territories have planned or put in place more than 1,000 social protection measures. But however, while new cases have started soaring again, these measures have flattened out. Cash transfers all over the world, there have been more than 1.1 billion people, or 14% of the world's population, have benefited from cash transfers. However, a recent UN report says that only 54 of 195 countries and territories have specific social protection measures targeting women, right? And we know that targeting women is very important, because being gender blind is not being gender neutral. Women find it hard enough to access schemes that are directed specifically for them, let alone general schemes. And we have schemes in India, Pakistan, and all over the world that address these. So the second point that I want to make is ensuring that women keep their jobs and businesses, in case where they own them, and minimize losses to their education. We know, again, from evidence that girls are at greater risk of losing their human capital in this pandemic. For example, in India, there is a 30% increase in new registrations at matrimonial websites. And an additional 200,000 girls are expected to be forced into child marriages in South Asia alone this year. Right? So what are some of the ways we can address these issues? When it comes to formal sector female employees, one very nice measure is reducing income taxation for female employees, and also payroll taxation, where government can pay the female share of females' payroll taxes. Now, this is very sound public finance, because we know that women have a higher elasticity of labor supply. That means women's labor supply responds more to their take-home wages, and especially where labor force participation is low. So this is a critical policy intervention that achieves a major social goal with sound public finances. Then another measure here is target funds for women-owned business. And on education, we just don't know enough. We need to understand better the case for understanding gender differences in access and learning through distance education. But what we do know is that marginalized girls have less access to technology and are greater risk of not returning to learn, even after post-COVID conditions. So this is something that is very important to keep in mind. And the third, and perhaps the most important, is the longer-term issue, that using the opportunity of the crisis to ensure that women come back stronger than before. As Melinda Gates has said, as governments rebuild their economies, they need to put women at the very center of their response. This is the only way we're going to recover from this pandemic stronger, more prepared, and more equal. So let me focus on three specific areas in how, for the long term, we can plan. And that's where I'll end after that. First was the issue that Anu highlighted, and really in the context of unpaid work. It was already a barrier earlier, right? Now we know that even before COVID, female labor force participation in South Asia was down from 31%, already very low, to 25% between 2005 and 2020. This is World Bank ILO data. So childcare is a massive issue. And here, while firms can take steps when you're in the formal sector, and Henriette will speak, I'm sure, more to that, and governments can do things like mandating parental leave, and especially for fathers, use it or leave it kind of leave for fathers. But I think the huge challenge especially for South Asia, is where you have very large informal sectors. And here, I think the solutions will have to be community-based. In India, we have some very good examples of the Government of India's integrated child development scheme and combined, but it's not a childcare solution. Then Seva in India has started a Seva Sangini Center scheme, which is right now focused in Gujarat that provide full-day childcare. And we know that women using these centers have reported a monthly income increase of between 500 to 1,000, and sometimes even 2,000 rupees. But similar centers will have to be expanded hugely to relieve women from full childcare responsibilities. This model has promise for the rest of the world, and there are examples from Brazil, the waste pickers, and from Ghana, the Makola market traders. The second aspect is the digital divide. I can't stress this enough. We know that there is a global digital divide. In India, in 2019, internet users were 67% male and 33% female. The gap is even bigger in the rural areas. And we know that the world becoming increasingly virtual, the digital divide is going to become a barrier for women to access critical education, health, and financial services, and becoming significant players in the activities or sectors that are becoming more digitized. So for the activities of the future, bridging the digital divide should be a massive priority. And here actions will need to focus on social norms, gender stereotypes, skills, affordability of the devices, and access related to financial inclusion, and a partnership between the public and private sector. And the final point is data collection by gender, right? So what is measured gets acted upon, right? Women are still, unfortunately, still treated as a niche, despite being half the world's population. And this phenomenon is the subject of an award-winning book by Caroline Cristina Perez called Invisible Women. There are many stunning anecdotes in the book. One, she reminds us that Andy Murray, two-time Olympic tennis gold medalist, was reminded of this fact by a reporter in 2016. And he said he's the first person to achieve this feat. And he said, really, I think Venus and Serena Williams have won the gold 4 times each. So, this is how women are forgotten. So data needs to focus on them, better data and research on gendered impacts of COVID-19, but also beyond that, there are general gaps in gender disaggregate data and lack of trend data. A UN Women initiative called Making Every Woman and Girl Count was launched in 2016 to create an environment to prioritize gender data and ensure quality and comparable gender statistics. More broadly, gendering of data needs to be mainstream. And these industries of the future, as I said, which is going to be, and all kinds of health and education services, women can do very well, provided they have equal opportunity. So in conclusion, I would say, initially, governments who provide stimulus and support, they should err on the side of more inclusion. Doesn't matter, spend, as the IMF is saying. And secondly, target women, because gender neutral is not being gender inclusive. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Kathuria. We'll come back to you and we'll ask you, since you've been a champion of, gender diversity and inclusion and cooperation in South Asia, what can women leaders across the border do to be able to forge relationships in communities that actually take the cause of diversity and inclusion forward? So I'll come back to you on that. Let me bring in Henriette. As I shared, Henriette is part of IFC and leads a group that looks at gender diversity and inclusion. She clearly has a vantage point from where she knows what's happening in the world. So let me bring in Henriette. All yours, Henriette.
Thank you so much, Anurag, and thank you to Tandonomics for having me on this panel. And first up, let me start with actually all of you who've tuned in this morning, this afternoon in India and from around the globe, to hope and wish that you are all healthy and well, and so is your families. Clearly, we've seen a second wave, and so our conversation couldn't in fact be more timely, because we've seen how cases around the world have spiked up, and so we hope foremost you're safe. But coming to more sort of the solution front, and maybe briefly illustrating what the International Finance Corporation is working on together with its private sector clients, I'd like to outline a couple of things, in fact, 6 solution-focused areas that very much anyone who's in the private sector can take on board and move forward with. And just to supplement, maybe before I jump into the 6 solution areas, just a couple more challenges that I feel we haven't yet touched upon. So one is gender-based violence, just to complement that, because that of course impacts what Anu said, the economic productivity, as well as of course, well-being and access to health and mental services. And so that's certainly something that we've seen gone up quite drastically, and I'll outline what the private sector can do about that in conjunction with community-based support and referral services. But certainly we've seen actually cases increase up to 20%. And so hotlines from around the world increase about 400% of callers during the pandemic. So something that's really worrisome. And the reason for that is, of course, the lack of mobility and people being under so much stress, losing their incomes, losing their employment, and indeed juggling. Still over 600 million children are at home. So at some point it was 1.1 billion. That has come down, but we still have a magnificent amount of children wanting to be looked after and cared for at the home. And so that combined stress is really sort of causing this spike in gender-based violence. Another sort of challenge that we've seen is that actually women are sort of more impacted by COVID, but not part of the solution. So if you look at the leadership structure of both the public and the private sector in designing these responses, we don't see women represented as much. So in fact, it's still about 18% only women in public leadership. And then if we look at, sort of the UN in its report on statistics of the women in the world right now, if we look at heads of state, again, it's only about 20 that are being headed by women. And yet we've seen an interesting correlation between female leadership at the state level and effectiveness of the pandemic response. So that might be something we want to dig in a little bit further and reflect on how is that panning out on the private sector side. But let me come to what can actually be done about mitigating for some of those widening gaps at the private sector. Let's kick off with employment. So we work with our clients around the world on making sure that women are retained in the workforce and of course being rehired into the workforce, and flesh out a couple of key policies that companies can take. One is, of course, and Anu, as well as Sanjay both alluded to that, is to obviously make sure that you can have parental leave, flexible work policy, and help women in particular move online, because a lot of companies have gone to home-based work, but if you're not equally able to connect and conduct your business online, and then in addition face not just offline harassment in your domestic sphere, but also the online harassment has increased, then you're left out in the economic recovery. So home-based work and technology solutions have to work for all. And so that's where we engage with our clients. The other part around employment, and again, Sanjay alluded to it, is childcare. Now, you might wonder, why is a development financing bank focusing on childcare? How does that come about? And in fact, actually, even pre-COVID, we said, look, in 26 countries, governments are making the private sector already legally obligated to provide childcare solutions. But oftentimes companies are completely at a loss what to do. What kind of support can they give to their employees? What kind of solutions? Does it be on-site, off-site childcare, vouchers, community-based partnerships? And so IFC, together with its partners around the world, has put forward some really concrete guidance as to how do you get to an employee care needs assessment, because you need to start at the point of where your employees are at. It depends on the sector, it depends on the location, is it urban, is it rural settings, and then help explain to companies what's the business benefit if you indeed open up support to childcare. And during COVID, we've seen the benefits because employees are much more productive staying in the workforce, and many times male-dominated sectors have in particular invested in hiring that female talent and now are losing at droves women who are voluntarily resigning from the formal labor market, as well as who are being made redundant involuntary. So the childcare piece is something that we work extremely hard, and we've seen very positive examples. Actually, in fact, a company in India had closed its childcare because it was pushing their own employees to work from home, but reopened their childcare for essential healthcare workers. And these are the types of innovative thinking that we need to see more of. And the last point around employment is mental health. We've seen huge, detrimental impact again on women around mental health, and we've seen very innovative practices for the first time that mental health issues are not anymore pushed to the sidelines, but are really being part of the mainstream conversations. We've seen AXA, for example, insurance companies globally hire dedicated providers for 24/7 hotlines just for their employees, as well as for the rest of their family. So it's not just the ones who are formally employed, but the wider community. And in fact, that helpline has been utilized so much they had to add new staff to help out. That just shows how much stress people are experiencing. And then frankly, I see that in my own team. So we are a global team deployed in 5 continents, 19 countries. The realities are very different in each one of them. But a lot of those who are single and actually don't have a family to rely on have asked to go back to their home countries because the mental pressure and the stress has just gone really high. So that's the employment bucket. Jumping off on the financial services bucket and entrepreneurship. And just to complement Facebook, OECD, and the IFC have done a study that shows that women entrepreneurs are much faster rates really closing temporarily down their business, as well as minority groups. Again, that holds true all over the world, is more pronounced in Africa and Asia, but really sort of worrying trends there. And so what can companies do in particular financial industry? One is really looking at working capital solutions. And we have made sure that when we help companies with our 8 billion recovery facilities, we use incentives to make sure that our banks that we invest in are not dropping their women customers and are really continuing to bank women. But banking alone is not enough. We know women need more than capital. And so we look at the insurance industry to see what can private insurance help, particular in this crisis. We've seen really interesting examples from Asia. For example, Insular Life in the Philippines has put together an incredible amount of holistic products that really are tailored through women's risks. But not only that, they provided non-financial services during the pandemic to really coach women on business resilience skills and what to do when you're thinking your business is going under. How can you prevent this from happening? So really fantastic work in the insurance industry, and we need to look there. Then lastly, I would say, looking at the financial digital payments, we've seen again, in terms of women are being 20% less likely to access the internet. But even if they are accessing the internet, they're not using it for productive services in their business. So how can we make sure that when we work with providers of goods, providers of labors, providers of services, providers of payment platforms, that sort of long-standing trend in the financial industry is not replicated in the online platforms? And there we've worked with the 17 of the largest tech companies in the world to do what Sanjay said. First of all, measure who's providing and who's using your goods. Second of all, what are the barriers to women not being able to sell more on e-commerce platform, to be able to drive more on ride-sharing platforms? What are those barriers? And then tackle those. And then how can you increase women's safeties on those platforms as passengers, as purchasers, and so on? So the digital solution is hugely important for the entrepreneurship angle as well. And then I'll finish up with, what can companies do on gender-based violence? Oftentimes sort of, the response would be, well, that's outside our remit, or that's not something we can control for. In fact, we've seen, in particular in the Pacific, but also beyond, where gender-based violence rates were very high to start with, how much domestic violence and sexual harassment at the workplace and bullying has led to productivity losses, obviously alongside huge suffering for the victims. And so we've measured that and actually could show to companies, here's what you're losing in terms of wage bill, productivity, and really concretely gave them the business case. And so now we see not only the multilateral development banks committing to screening their investment yields around the risks on gender-based violence, but companies to step up. And even more so that the ILO has put out a new convention, obviously last June, that really hones in on workplace harassment as a key driver for positive engagement at the workplace. And so we've seen companies take a couple of steps. One is they're assessing, again, looking at their company walls, what is the impact of bullying and sexual harassment? Second, putting in place policies on safer workplaces. And that has a whole slew of things, policies as well as programs, because it's not good enough to have paper and grievance mechanisms. You need to actually translate that into action. And then regular stock taking to see, is it working or not working? And one last thing that we've learned is just talking about sexual harassment at the workplace is not enough. You need to bring in the fact of bullying, because if you talk sexual harassment, you have pitted oftentimes men as the perpetrators against women, the victims. And immediately any dialogue falls short. So in terms of creating a solution, you need to see who of the men is also feeling unsafe at work, mainly through bullying, and then bring both genders together and say, how do we collectively want to design a workforce that's united, motivated, productive, and feeling safe. So with that, we can come back and revisit hopefully a couple of those issues. I'll close out for our next round of conversation.
Thank you, Henriette, for giving us a very comprehensive view and data and a real slice of what's happening in the world. But and you told us a lot about solutions. But tell us one more thing. As a woman leader, what were some of the key challenges that you have personally faced while working on conflict reduction, civic education, and other socioeconomic issues which come in the way of gender equality?
Sure.
And how did you cope up with them? It could be inspiring for other women on the broadcast, as well as, it could kind of give us some pointers on what they could do.
Absolutely. So actually, to Anu's point, so juggling care and work. So I have a newborn baby, 10 months by now, and so that's pretty pretty intense. And then I also had foster teenagers. So those are kids in the US who come to live with you when they come from a challenging situation. And so explaining social distancing and wearing masks to a teenager is one thing, and obviously applying that to a baby is a whole other question. So that's been on a personal front, in some ways a challenge, but also a joy, because it focuses you to be in the present. And I think living in the present is something that's really grounding, because it allows you to control for things that are within your remit of influence, and to let go of worries as much as you can that outside of your immediate controllable environment. But more importantly, what also worried me was, indeed, as I briefly alluded to, I have a team of 60 people around the world who are doing a lot of the day-to-day really challenging work in a lot of conflict countries. So the largest footprint I have is in fact in places like Myanmar, in Solomon Islands, in Sri Lanka, and so on. So it's areas that are really hard hit by COVID. And so how to keep my team supported throughout of this. And there were 3 techniques that I've used. So one is to make a lot more room for smaller group conversations and one-on-one personal conversations, because of course, you're more likely to share vulnerabilities, worries, and challenges in a smaller group setting than in much more transactional team meetings. So that's what's important. At the same time, I see the workload rise. So I'm trying to juggle, creating more personal space for my team, as well as making sure we are more selective in terms of what we can get accomplished and what we have to say, look, this is maybe something we do pick up in 3 months and in 6 months, and the same with clients. Second one was indeed, how do we engage with clients? When clients are feeling the pressure from all sides, what do you want to do? Yes, you have your work program to continue, but more importantly, again, you check in on a personal basis and say, we know we have this gender program with you, and for us that's still important, but are there other things that the entirety of the Wellbeing Group can help you with, and really broaden out our vision? The third one is, I would say, think of acts of kindness and distraction in a nice way. And what I mean by that is, I love poetry. I have loved it all my life, and poetry doesn't take long to read, which is a nice byproduct. So sometimes, I start team meetings by actually reading out a poem or sharing a poem, or in fact, actually asking everyone in the team to pick something in the room that they valued for a long time and why they value, to open us more as human beings to extend these acts of kindness, which come more natural to us if we don't see each other as roles and functions, but if we see each other as, multiple identities. And I think that's the last point I'd make, is intersectionality in all of that. We talk about women, right? But we've seen, of course, how much more minority women have been impacted again by COVID, as well as by, in existing inequalities way before COVID, but that has just brought it out more around race, around age, and of course, around income, assets, and so on. So that's my little piece of input on that.
Thank you, Henriette. And when you were speaking, I was wondering if there was a study done by World Bank or IFC which looked at who are more resilient, women or men. I have no doubt that possibly women are more resilient than men. I mean, I hate making generalization, but my gut feel tells me that it possibly would be the case. Anu, coming to you, now you recently written that any drive for gender parity arguably starts with efforts to change the very deeply entrenched, widespread attitudes about what a woman's role in the society is. What is the role of a woman at work? What is the role of woman as a leader? How is it different from the man? So hence, what is the kind of interventions do you think are needed?
I think it's a very, very sort of profound set of beliefs, right? That is ingrained and nurtured and very unconsciously developed in all human beings as they grow up in their families and society and so on. And this set of beliefs sort of determines what's okay, how do you behave based on your gender, right? From childhood onwards. I think I mean, just speaking from personal experience, right? Maybe just share a little bit there. Uh, I was fortunate enough to be brought up in a family where there were no overt gender norms. I was not viewed differently from my brother. And for the longest time, I did not think that I was different as a result. But I have to say that even being brought up with such norms, I had my first moment of truth when I had my children. And then the penny dropped because I realized that there are real responsibilities, and they do fall in any kind of context, they do fall disproportionately on women. I don't ever like to call it a burden because I think it's a joy and a privilege. But my point is that that joy and privilege should be equally experienced and contributed, right, by both genders. It need not be gender specific. Now, I think in this time of COVID, like I have, for example, I have two teenagers now. So I have been working for over 20 years in a fairly high, fast paced, challenging kind of professional environment. But I've succeeded in doing that because I've sort of challenged a few norms around saying, flexible working, remote working, working that in a model that helps you kind of balance all these priorities is okay, right? But for the longest time, while my firm was very supportive, I think I was in a minority. I was one of the few people who cared about that enough or wanted that, simply because there were few women in those senior roles, right? Now, I think in a strange kind of way, what's happened in the time of COVID is that it's been a moment of truth for a lot of men, just as much as women. Because I think for the first time, this notion of what is the lived experience of trying to juggle home and work, I hear a lot of male colleagues and a lot of male, people that I interact with outside of work as well, raising this issue of saying that, oh, I have for the first time learned how to cook. I'm actually, cleaning my apartment or looking after my small child because there is no help and everyone has to pitch in and do it, right? So suddenly these notions of how do you work on a remote basis? How do you actually draw boundaries in terms of your time? Um, is it okay if I have a small child and the child enters my conference call and my video screen because it's very hard to keep the child away? And this is happening to women, but it's also happening to men. And we are seeing this. So it's in a way a big normalizer and equalizer. And I think it's going to be important to hold on to that process of awakening and eyes opening for a lot of men. It's going to be important to hold on to that and to really make it normal for both men and women to want and embrace, flexibility at work. The other big insight for me is that there are people who are, as Henriette quite rightly said, not maybe in those extreme stressful conflict situations, but they are experiencing isolation, because of the environment they're in right now. Equally, there are a set, I would put myself in the second set, where I think my connectivity has actually improved because of the situation I'm in. I'm very productive. I'm able to spend all my time talking. Zoom makes it very easy. So there are people who've kind of benefited from greater connectivity, but there are also people who haven't. And I think as women leaders in particular, or in general as leaders, it is very important to tune into the individuals and where they are on that spectrum, and to really double down on the connectivity aspect and make sure that
The
people
digital
who
divide, the digital divide actually becomes the
because there are
digital
some who
equalizer.
respond well to the digital environment and become closer to other people, but there are others who don't, who need the
Absolutely.
water cooler conversations, the
Yeah,
in-person
yeah,
interaction.
absolutely.
There are
The
different
office is a
psychographic
getaway
types.
for a lot
Yeah,
of
for a
us.
lot of people.
Office sometimes is a getaway. Coming to you, Dr. Kathuria, you heard Henriette and Anu say what they said, and you shared some data with us. I asked you, how do you think women across the border can collaborate to be able to create some of the solutions that you alluded to, that Henriette talked, that Anu is talking. So how do you think that collaboration can take place from here on?
Thank you, Anurag. So, I think in a sense, so I always tell my wife as well that I wish we had uh, across borders, we had more women dealing with each other than we have had in South Asia. So there are, the most fundamental thing is, for example, trading, right? So South Asia levies a lot of barriers on trade with each other. So we are the lowest share of intra-regional trade of any region in the world. And we know, for example, there was a recent World Bank WTO study that trade treats women better than the domestic sector. There is more women participation and there are the higher wages when it comes to international trade. So that's true for, obviously, for cross-border trade. So one is to, if we reduce the barriers, then women will step up, they will participate more. The other thing is that I would like to bring in this aspect of, the women's qualities, some of their unique qualities, the grit and grace that is the theme of this conference. One of the major issues you find that despite this era of, connectivity and so on, there are such major misconceptions about neighbors across the border, even by educated youngsters who are very, connectivity savvy. So there are misconceptions and lack of people-to-people connect. So here, I think women can play a huge role, leadership role in that people-to-people connect with empathy and with grit and grace. I would like to give an example that, when I was in the World Bank, and my colleagues in the bank still support an annual South Asia Economic Students Meet, where 80 students from 7 South Asian countries.
Start early. You're saying start early.
Yeah, it's been going on for about 15 years now. It's a great venture, and we have been supporting that. Every year, students get together in a venue and spend 5 or 6 days together. And then interestingly, you would find that always the one set of students who are always glued to each other are the ones from India and Pakistan. They cannot leave each other's side, right? And they cry. Literally, they have cried in Chittagong. They cried when they were go back to Dhaka to catch their respective flights back home. They were weeping on the shoulders of their faculty members, and that's the kind of thing that we would like to use. And there are a lot of women students amongst this this economic students meet. So I think that is where women can come in and play a much bigger role than they have done so far in the relationship aspect. Because at the end of the day, there are so many misconceptions when these students say, "Oh, sir, we didn't know that the ones across the border, they're just like us. We didn't know they were just like us." So organizations like SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association that I also mentioned earlier, they have actually been doing cross-border work also, training women craftsmen, for example, in Bhutan, and helping them, bringing their skills up so they can trade both locally as well as internationally cross-border. So I think, and lastly, if we can have more women in leadership, again, it comes back to the issue of leadership both in the private sector as well as in the public sector, right? Everybody said, Princess Mabel also mentioned how few women are there globally in women leadership positions, and Henriette, everybody has talked about it. So I think if we can have more women leadership, both public and private, we will see, I think, better relationships improving cross-border. I can almost guarantee that that would happen. So I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kathuria. We're near the end line as we say time, so I want you to make one prediction for the future in terms of where you see gender diversity and inclusion headed. Very Twitter-like. So I'll start with you, Dr. Kathuria. If we had to see 12 months from now, what is one thing you see happening?
Oh, fortune teller's hat. No, it's. I would say that I would like to, because there are very, there are lots of differences, but I think the digital divide, and there are some hopeful trends there, especially, for example, in cities, we are seeing less of a divide than in the rural areas. And I hope that this wave can, the urban kind of trend can also catch on in the rural areas. And I think this will be critical for making women stronger in a post-COVID world, even in a COVID world, but especially in the post-COVID world. And I hope that, and because something like connectivity, mobile connectivity can take off very quickly. This doesn't need years and years to take off because firms are very entrepreneurial in this space. So I hope on the digital front in 12 months, we will see a significantly improved connectivity and therefore a greater ability of women to navigate this increasingly complex world.
Thank you, Dr. Kathuria. Henriette, your quick last comment. Next 12 months, what would you like to see happen, or you can see it happen?
At least you didn't ask us to predict the outcome of the US election. Yeah, 12-month forecast. What I would love. Yeah.
Then we finally may see a women president, American president in the US at some stage in the next 5 years. But yes, go
on. Well, what I would love to see is something that's long overdue, and I think Anu mentioned it. It's a much larger commitment to investing in childcare and elderly care, both at the family front to equalize. And I think a lot of articles really do also illustrate how men have enjoyed, despite some of the challenges and economic hardships, this totally new experience to actually re-engage much more with their kids. So the rebalance at home, the rebalance at work, as well as the rebalance in budgets that national governments have. I think that's something that I'm hopeful for, that we emerge out of the pandemic with a much, much stronger understanding that we cannot shortchange our children, cannot shortchange our workplace, we cannot shortchange ourselves, and that we come together in a union that's collectively appreciating the space that can be created for the next generation.
Thank you, Henriette. Anu, your final word. What would you like to see happen in the next 12 months, or you can see it happen?
3 things. The first is that remote and flexible working becomes normal, as people have understood that through the crisis, that it has some benefits and helps women.
And it has impact on gender diversity and inclusion. You're saying for a lot of women that is in some way helps them.
It helps them. And it needs to be understood that it's a normal need, right? The hybrid remote model, as I call it. The second is, I think Henriette said it, I think thinking about the care economy as a public good and a public infrastructure, and at least one innovative model that brings the best of quality, certification, training, affordability, a model that can actually do that at scale. Would love to see a collaboration between public and private being rolled out, but fixing some of these reliability, quality, certification, credentialing, because these are the barriers as to why it doesn't really happen. And then the third thing is, I think, just taking the backbone infrastructures of most of our countries, whether it's digital or financial, and again, a big understanding that this is an essential part of functioning of society and economy in any crisis. This has to be made resilient, reach that last mile, last household, last woman, and then ideally at least one experiment or initiative to link the right data to those backbones. As Henriette and Sanjay said, we need the data. We need to know who's out there, who's benefiting.
You can only improve what you can measure. So yes, clearly you need it. So thank you so much, Anu, Henriette, and Dr. Kathuria for being so specific, so deep. And we couldn't have had anybody better than 3 of you to talk about what we talked. Leadership with grit and grace, but I would also say my gratitude to you. So thank you for being great panelists, and I'm sure the audience has enjoyed your inputs and have taken away some data, some thoughts that they could implement to be able to make the world a better place. Thank you so much. Thank you to Talentonomics to give me this opportunity to be part of this conference and to be able to be with you on a panel. So grateful for that. I learned something new. And back to Aparna. Thank you so much. And I hope and pray Biden wins. I have 2 reasons for that. One, I bet a lot of money on that. Second, any would be better than Trump. So So I hope we can celebrate that with you soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the wonderful session. Indeed, the pandemic times have been a moment of awakening for all of us. A lot of balancing act done by equally by both men as well as women. So thanks again to the esteemed panelists, Henriette, Anu, and Dr. Sanjay. And special thanks to Dr. Anurag for moderating the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To all.
So Anish, are you back here now on this session? Well, our colleague Anish would be anytime here to share some exciting news about what's happening. But to reiterate a few things about the leaderboard especially, you can see that on the home page or essentially the reception tab. Each one of you have an opportunity to earn points and top the leaderboard. You can earn points by attending the most sessions, answering questions on contest page, taking part in the in-session polls, answering questions in Q&A or chat, liking, commenting on others' posts, and posting on event feed. Top 5 leaders will be getting exciting prizes, including a book by Talentonomics India. Well, please do continue engaging with us. There are enormous opportunities to engage with us, right? We are now heading towards a 15 minutes break and we join back at 3:35 sharp India time. So please enjoy your break and see you on the other side. Thank you.